The airport was unusually quiet for a busy morning. The usual buzz of chatter and footsteps was muffled by the thick air of anticipation. Something was off. Sarah felt at the moment she stepped into the terminal. It wasn't the usual rush of the early morning travellers who were busy hurrying to make their flights. It was the silent hum that filled the space around her like the calm before a storm. She brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she checked her watch and scanned the crowd. It was going to be another full flight today, but something felt different. Even though the morning seemed like any other day, it was the kind of quiet Sarah had learned to recognize, the one right before everything went sideways. Sarah had been a flight attendant for over 15 years. She had seen it all: the rude passengers, the demanding celebrities, the ones who tried to sneak extra luggage or cut the line. She had dealt with them all with her signature calm that came from years of experience. But today felt different. As she moved through the gate area, she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would test her patience more than any other. She stopped briefly to check the list of passengers and noticed the names of a few VIPs highlighted in bold. It wasn't uncommon to have high-profile passengers on a flight, but something about these names made her pause. One in particular stood out. It was a name Sarah had heard whispers about in the crew lounge before, a name that sent a ripple of discomfort through her, even among the more seasoned flight attendants who had dealt with the usual arrogance of celebrities and business tycoons. The announcement came suddenly, filling the air with a familiar mechanical voice that echoed through the terminal, calling the premium passengers to board. First, Sarah glanced up from her list as the loudspeakers crackled the usual request, followed by a polite reminder for passengers with priority boarding to make their way to the gate. She glanced over to the side and saw the manager of the airline standing by the door, his posture stiff, his eyes scanning the crowd like he was waiting for something. She couldn't shake the feeling that today's boarding was going to be anything but routine. She had always prided herself on handling difficult situations with grace, but the air felt thick with tension. And then he appeared, a man in a tailored suit, walking through the entrance like he owned the place. His demeanor was unmistakable. The air around him seemed to shift as people instinctively took a step back. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she recognized him immediately. It was him, the VIP, the one everyone had whispered about. He was a media mogul, known for his ruthless business tactics and demanding attitude. He didn't have to say a word yet. Somehow everyone seemed to know who he was. His presence commanded attention, and the moment he stepped into the terminal, all eyes turned toward him. Sarah could feel her stomach tighten in response. There was no mistaking it. He was here to get what he wanted. He moved quickly without hesitation, as if accustomed to bypassing the rules of normal people. Sarah watched as he made his way toward the boarding line. He was heading straight for the front, like he didn't even notice the line of passengers waiting their turn to board the flight. His face was cold, his expression unbothered by the eyes following him, yet there was something about the way he carried himself that made Sarah's skin crawl. It wasn't arrogance. She had seen that before. This was something darker, a sense of entitlement that could only come from years of getting everything he wanted without challenge. Sarah's hand gripped the edge of the podium as she watched him continue toward the gate ahead of the first-class passengers. Sarah could feel the murmurs start to ripple through the crowd. The other passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, some shaking their heads, others holding their breath, as if waiting for something to happen. The line was beginning to blur between who was in charge here, the rules of boarding, or the man who seemed to think they didn't apply to him. Sarah hesitated for just a moment as she saw him move closer to the door of the plane. She knew what she had to do. She had done it countless times before, reminding passengers of the rules, keeping things orderly. But this was different. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, and in that moment she realized that this flight wasn't going to be like the others, not by a long shot. The tension in the air was thick. Sarah's fingers tightened around the podium as she watched the VIP approach the door. The murmurs of the surrounding passengers grew louder, like a ripple across water. Some looked away in discomfort, while others watched with growing curiosity. It was like they were all waiting for something to happen. The sense of unease was palpable, but no one dared to speak up. Not yet. Sarah knew the rules, as well as anyone on the team. First class would board first, followed by business, and then economy. The system was simple and fair. It had worked for years without a hitch, but today it felt like the rules didn't matter anymore. The VIP reached the front of the line, and without a second thought continued to step toward the door of the plane, his eyes scanning the boarding pass scanner, as if he owned the entire gate area, without hesitation, without any recognition of the other passengers, standing patiently in line. He was about to cross the threshold, and Sarah knew this was her moment. It was now or never. The thought of letting him pass without challenge made her stomach churn. There was no way she could stand by and let him break the rules in front of everyone, the passengers, the crew, the manager. She had to stop him. She stepped forward with purpose, her voice steady but firm, as she addressed the VIP. Sir, I'm afraid you need to wait your turn. The first-class passengers are boarding now. The VIP stopped in his tracks, his head slowly turned toward her, and in that moment the world around them seemed to fall away. The murmurs of the crowd faded into the background as all eyes turned toward them. His gaze was cold, his lips curled into a faint sneer, as if surprised that anyone would dare challenge him. He looked down at Sarah from his towering height, his posture unbothered as he smirked. Do you know who I am? He asked, his voice low and slow, as if the question alone should answer everything. The question hung in the air, heavy with arrogance and entitlement. But Sarah didn't flinch. She had heard that line 100 times before. It was the same question that arrogant passengers asked when they thought their status could give them a free pass through the system. But today she wasn't backing down, and she wasn't going to let him make a mockery of the rules. Yes, sir, I do, she said. But everyone follows the same procedure, and you'll need to wait for your turn, just like everyone else. She kept her tone professional, but there was no mistaking the firmness in her voice. Her heart raced, but she stood tall, not letting her nerves show. The silence that followed felt almost unnatural. The passengers around them held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The VIP's smirk faltered for just a second as he stared at Sarah, but it didn't last long. His gaze darkened, and he took a step forward, his voice rising with anger. So you're telling me I have to wait behind all these people when I have a flight to catch? His tone was sharp now, and there was an edge of menace in it, as if he wasn't used to being told no. The pressure was mounting, and Sarah could feel it. She could feel the weight of the situation building up around her, but she refused to let him intimidate her. Not now. Yes, sir, she said again without hesitation, but if you would just wait for the first-class passengers to board, you'll be able to get on right after that. It's only a few minutes. There was no way she could give in to his demands. Not now, not when so many people were watching. The passengers around them were starting to murmur again, some in disbelief, others in quiet support. But Sarah didn't take her eyes off the VIP. She stood her ground, even though her heart was pounding in her chest. For a moment the VIP said nothing. He simply stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and fury. Sarah could feel his frustration building. It was almost palpable, and for a brief moment she wondered if he might snap. But then he took a step back, his lip curling into a sneer as he glanced around at the crowd, who were now all watching the scene unfold. I don't have time for this, he muttered under his breath, but he didn't move. He was still there, standing before her like a storm waiting to break. The silence between Sarah and the VIP stretched on longer than she expected. Every second felt like an eternity. The weight of all those eyes on her was almost unbearable. Yet she didn't move, she didn't look away. The VIP was still staring at her like she was an inconvenience. He couldn't understand. The crowd was watching every movement, every breath they took. They were waiting for something to break, waiting to see who would win this quiet battle. Sarah could feel the tension building in her chest, but she kept her posture straight, her hands steady on the podium. He broke the silence with a cold chuckle, that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "Oh, this is rich," he muttered, barely loud enough for her to hear. It was clear he was trying to maintain control of the situation, trying to remind her that he wasn't a man to be trifled with. But she stood her ground. Sarah knew exactly what kind of person. He was a man who believed his money and status gave him power over everyone else he had probably never been told no in his life, and certainly never by someone like her. The VIP took another step toward her, but this time it was deliberate, his movements, slow, calculated like a predator, circling his prey. Sarah could feel his presence looming over her, but she didn't move an inch, still standing between him and the door of the plane like a silent barrier blocking his way. She saw his eyes flicker toward the door where the flight attendants had begun to board the first-class passengers, and she could see his impatience, growing, the impatience of a man who wasn't used to waiting for anything. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low this time, and there was something more menacing in it, as if he had finally lost his patience. She could tell this wasn't a man who liked to be told what to do, and she had just made that mistake. She had just put herself in his way. His voice dropped to a whisper, so only she could hear, "I'll make sure you regret this." His words didn't faze her, not really. She had dealt with worse in her time on the job. There had been rude passengers with more power than him, but something about this situation felt different. Maybe it was the eyes of the crowd watching. Maybe it was the way the manager was standing off to the side with his arms crossed, like he was waiting for something to happen. She glanced over her shoulder for a moment and saw the manager's face. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the VIP, as if waiting for him to make a move. For a brief second, Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. She didn't like the way the manager was watching this unfold. He had always been supportive in the past, but today something about the way he stood there made her uneasy. It was like he was silently waiting for Sarah to back down. It was a subtle shift, but she felt it all the same. The VIP took another step closer to her, and Sarah knew this was the moment where everything would either change or spiral out of control. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone, his fingers tapping rapidly across the screen without taking his eyes off her. He was making a call, and Sarah knew exactly who he was calling. It didn't take a genius to figure that out. She tried not to let her frustration show. She kept her voice steady, even though she felt the anger boiling inside. "I'm sorry, sir, but the rules are clear," she said as calmly as she could. "We can't let anyone board out of order." The VIP didn't respond. Instead, he pressed the phone to his ear, his eyes still locked on hers, as if daring her to stop him. It was then that she heard the soft click of heels behind her. The manager had finally moved, and he was approaching them. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, his eyes flickering toward the VIP, before returning to Sarah with a look that sent a chill through her spine. She knew what was coming next, but she wasn't ready for it. The manager reached them and cleared his throat loudly. Sarah turned to face him, but his eyes were already on the VIP, and in that moment she knew everything was about to change. The manager stood beside Sarah now. His presence suddenly felt overpowering, like a shadow looming over her. He was calm, his expression unreadable, but there was a tension in the air that Sarah couldn't ignore. She had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who was about to make a decision that would change everything, but it wasn't for her benefit. She knew that now. The VIP's calls seemed to be going on forever. Sarah could hear the faint buzz of his voice, but couldn't make out the words. His gaze never left her. As he spoke into the phone, the power he exuded was palpable. Every inch of him screamed authority. It was like he was daring her to challenge him any further. But Sarah was running out of patience. Her eyes flicked to the manager again, wondering if he was going to do something, anything to back her up. But instead, he stood there silently, arms folded, his gaze flickering between her and the VIP. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the frustration building like a storm ready to break. She had done everything by the look, everything they had taught her when she started this job. But now it felt like it didn't matter. None of it mattered. The rules, the protocol, everything was being thrown out the window in favor of one man's power and influence. The manager shifted slightly, his eyes narrowed as the VIP continued to speak, his fingers twitching, as if he were about to make a decision. Sarah could almost feel his indifference towards her. She'd have been loyal to the airline for so long, but in that moment she realized loyalty didn't mean much when you were standing in the way of someone with influence. The VIP hung up the phone with a click and turned his full attention to Sarah now. There was something in his eyes, a cold calculation, as he sized her up like she was nothing more than an obstacle in his way. He straightened his posture and stepped closer to her, the air between them thick with tension. "Do you really think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't answer him, not at first, because she wasn't sure what to say. He was right. In a way, he could probably walk past her, and no one would stop him. But if she let him get away with this, it would be a message to every other passenger, every other employee, that the rules didn't matter, that power and money would always win. She couldn't let that happen. "I'm sorry, sir, but no," she said, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. "The first-class passengers are boarding now. You'll have to wait." The VIP's lips curled into a sneer, his eyes flashing with anger. "You've made a big mistake." He muttered, his voice low, like a warning. Sarah could feel the weight of his words settle over her, his gaze burning with fury, as if she had personally insulted him. The manager stepped forward now, his hand raised like he was trying to calm the situation. But the way he looked at Sarah told her everything she needed to know. It was a look that spoke volumes, a look that told her she was on her own. "It's fine," the manager said, his voice smooth and controlled. "There's no need to escalate this further. Let him board. It'll only take a minute." He turned to Sarah, his eyes cold. "I think you've made your point." For a moment, Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. The words felt like a slap in the face. She had stood her ground. She had done everything right. But now it was clear that the manager had already chosen his side. Sarah's stomach turned with a sickening realization. She wasn't just fighting against the VIP. She was fighting against the very system she had spent years working for. The crowd around them had gone completely silent, waiting for the next move. No one said a word as the VIP stepped past her with a smug grin on his face, as if he had just won some great victory. But to Sarah, it felt like a defeat. As the VIP walked past her, Sarah felt her heart sink. She had stood her ground. But in the end, it hadn't mattered. She had lost. The VIP walked past her with a smug grin as he made his way toward the door of the plane. Sarah could feel the coldness of his presence lingering in the air like a storm cloud. But the worst part wasn't his arrogance. It was the weight of the manager's words still ringing in her ears. There was no need to escalate this further. Let him board. It'll only take a minute. Sarah's mind spun with disbelief. How could he say that? How could he just let him walk past her like that after everything they'd been through together? Her fingers clenched around the edge of the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. The crowd around her had fallen into a thick silence. Some passengers glanced nervously at one another, but no one dared speak up. Sarah could feel the eyes on her, the weight of their expectations. She had tried to do the right thing. She had stood up for the rules, but now it felt like everything had slipped away from her. The manager turned to her with a calm expression, but Sarah could see the subtle glint of something behind his eyes, something that made her stomach churn. The truth was clear now. He had no intention of backing her up, and that realization hit harder than any word he could have spoken. She watched as the VIP stepped onto the plane, his back straight with that same confident air, as if he had just conquered something. Sarah fought the urge to lash out, to shout at the injustice of it all. But she knew it wouldn't matter, not now, not when the balance of power had already shifted. She was just a small part of a much bigger machine, and right now the machine had chosen its side. As the last of the first-class passengers boarded, the gate agent began to direct the business-class passengers forward. Sarah knew it was time to let them through, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Not yet. She stood there frozen in place, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. But none of them made sense. How had it all come to this? How had she gone from being the confident, experienced flight attendant who could handle any situation to someone who had just let herself be steamrolled by a man who didn't even respect the rules? She turned to face the manager, but he was already walking away, his back to her. As he moved toward the plane, Sarah felt a sickening sense of abandonment flood over her. It was as if she had been cast aside like an afterthought. He didn't even acknowledge her. As he passed her by like she no longer existed. For a moment she considered walking away, just walking out of the terminal and leaving it all behind. The pressure was too much, the sting of failure too sharp. But something deep inside her wouldn't let her go just yet. She couldn't walk away. She had too much pride for that, even though everything inside her screamed to give up. She could not like this, not without fighting for what was right. Sarah took a deep breath as she forced her legs to move and began to direct the business class passengers forward. She felt the weight of their eyes on her too as they passed her by, but it wasn't the same as before now. It felt like they were all silently judging her, as if they could tell she had just lost everything she had worked for. But she kept her face neutral, her voice steady, as she called out the boarding instructions. It wasn't until the last passenger in line had boarded that she turned back to face the gate area again. Her gaze fell on the VIP, who was seated comfortably in first class, his smug expression still fresh. In her mind, the sight of him in that seat made her stomach twist. But she couldn't look away. She had failed, and she knew it. But the more she stood there, the more she realized she had one last chance to regain some of her dignity. Sarah took another deep breath and squared her shoulders. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot, and if it was going to cost her everything, she wasn't going down without a fight. Sarah stood there watching the last of the passengers board, and for the first time in years she felt utterly alone. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible force, and it was suffocating every breath she took felt heavy, as if the air itself was pushing back against her. She had made a choice today, and it hadn't been the right one. She could feel the sting of failure creeping in. She had been pushed into a corner, and now it seemed like everything she had worked for was slipping through her fingers. The sound of the closing door echoed in the terminal, signaling the last of the boarding process was over, and the plane was about to depart. But Sarah couldn't move, not yet. She stood frozen in place, still staring at the VIP, who was now settled comfortably in his first-class seat, his eyes hidden behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses, as if he didn't care about anything happening outside of his little bubble of entitlement. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. The anger, the frustration, the overwhelming sense of powerlessness had all collided within her, and she didn't know where to channel it anymore. It felt like everything she had ever believed in had been torn apart. In front of her eyes, the system that had been in place for so long had been shattered, and she was left holding the pieces, wondering if there was any way to put it back together. Her gaze shifted toward the manager, who had disappeared onto the plane moments earlier. His actions had spoken louder than any words he had given his decision, and Sarah had no choice but to accept it. She felt her stomach turn as she thought about how easily he had let the VIP push through the rules, without a second thought, the way he had sided with him, without any regard for what Sarah had fought for. For a brief moment Sarah considered leaving the terminal, walking away from it all, but something deep inside her refused to give up. There had to be something. She could do something that would make this right. She couldn't just let it go. She had been a part of this airline for so long. She had given everything to her job, and now it felt like it was all slipping away, as if none of it had ever mattered. Without thinking, Sarah turned and walked toward the gate office. She couldn't just let the situation go without some kind of resolution. She needed to speak to someone, anyone who might listen. But when she reached the door, she paused. The office was empty. No one was there to hear her frustration, her anger, her disappointment. No one to give her the answers she desperately needed. It was then that she heard the voice behind her, the familiar voice of her colleague, the one who had worked alongside her for years. Sarah turned to find Jane standing in the doorway, looking at her with concern written all over her face. "Are you okay?" Jane asked, her voice soft yet filled with a kind of understanding that only comes from someone who's seen you at your best and worst. Sarah didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure how to explain the rush of emotions swirling inside her, the sense of betrayal, the injustice, the way she felt like she had lost everything in the span of just a few minutes. She was so close to breaking down, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Jane," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jane stepped closer and placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stood there waiting, giving Sarah the space to collect her thoughts. Sarah could feel the comfort in her friend's touch, but it didn't stop the feelings of anger and frustration from bubbling up inside her. "I did everything by the book, Jane," Sarah's voice cracked. "I followed the rules, and they still let him through like it didn't matter, like none of it mattered." Jane sighed and nodded. "I know it's hard, but sometimes we don't get to control the outcome. Sometimes we have to play by different rules than we want to." "But I can't just let it go," Sarah said, looking Jane in the eyes. "I can't let them think they can walk all over us." Jane's eyes softened, but there was a hint of something else in them, something that Sarah hadn't seen before, a kind of quiet strength. "We all have our limits, Sarah," she said. "Sometimes standing up for what's right means knowing when to walk away." Sarah stood in the office, her heart racing. The words Jane had spoken echoed in her mind like a warning, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that walking away wasn't the answer, not this time. She had always stood by what was right, no matter how difficult, no matter how much it cost her. But now she was standing at a crossroads, unsure of which direction to take. She wanted to fight, she wanted to scream at the injustice, but a part of her felt like that fight was slipping away from her, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to get it back. She turned toward the window, looking out at the tarmac, where the plane was just beginning to taxi away. The engines roared in the distance, and for a moment everything felt distant, like she was no longer part of it, like she had been disconnected from the life she had known for so long. Her life had always been tied to the airport, the flights, the passengers, and now it felt like all of that was slipping through her fingers. It wasn't just the VIP, it wasn't just the manager, it was the whole system, the way things had been shifting under her feet for months now, the way everything felt like it was changing faster than she could keep up. She had seen it in the eyes of her colleagues, in the way they avoided confrontation, the way they just accepted things the way they had always been. But Sarah had never been the type to accept things without question. She had never been the type to just roll over. "I can't let it go," she muttered to herself, her voice barely audible in the quiet office. Jane was still standing behind her, not speaking, just waiting. Sarah could feel their presence like a silent anchor to the world around her, but she still didn't know what to do. Her mind raced as she thought about all the things she could say, all the ways she could fight back. But something inside her told her that no matter how loud she shouted, no matter how right she was, none of it would matter. Maybe it was the realization that the people in power would always have the final word. Maybe it was the realization that the system was broken. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to believe that fighting for the right thing was a losing battle. She couldn't accept it, not without giving it everything she had. She turned around to face Jane, her eyes filled with determination. "It wasn't over," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not going to let him win. I'm not going to let them think they can just walk all over us like that." Jane looked at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable, but Sarah could see the flicker of concern behind her eyes. She knew this wasn't just about a single VIP or a single confrontation. It was bigger than that. It was about everything that had changed in the airline, everything that had shifted beneath their feet, like a quiet storm threatening to swallow them whole. "But what can you do?" Jane finally asked, her voice gentle. "There's no one left to back you up, Sarah. There's no one who will stand with you." Sarah hesitated, but the fire inside her burned brighter. She couldn't just give up, not yet, not when it felt like the fight was slipping away. She had worked too hard for this. She had sacrificed too much. and she wasn't about to let some arrogant passenger and a manager who didn't care decide her fate for her. "I'll find a way," she said through clenched teeth, her hands shaking, but her resolve unshaken. "I'll make them listen." She turned away from the window, walking toward the door before Jane could stop her. "Where are you going?" Jane asked, following her out into the hallway. "To talk to someone who can make a difference," Sarah said. Without looking back, she didn't know who that someone was, but she knew she couldn't let this go. She couldn't walk away from this fight. The hallways were empty as they walked down toward the supervisor's office. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, but the further she walked, the clearer her thoughts became. She had been pushed into a corner, and she had almost accepted it, but now she was making the choice to stand up to everything that had made her feel powerless, everything that had made her feel invisible in the face of authority and money. She wouldn't let it happen anymore. She reached the supervisor's door, her hand hovering over the handle. She didn't know what would happen when she opened it, but she was ready. She was ready to fight. Sarah stood before the supervisor's door, her hand still hovering above the handle. The weight of what she was about to do felt immense. Every part of her body screamed for her to turn back, to leave it all behind. But she couldn't. She had made her decision, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. She had already lost so much today, but if there was even a chance to regain a sliver of her dignity, she would take it. She pushed the door open without hesitation. The office was quiet and dimly lit, a single desk lamp casting a soft glow on the papers strewn across the desk. The supervisor was sitting with his back to her, his head slightly tilted as he reviewed something on his computer screen. But as soon as the door creaked open, he turned around, his eyes flicking up to meet hers with a sharpness that sent a chill down her spine. Sarah stood there for a moment, just looking at him, feeling the weight of the moment hang in the air. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. It was now or never. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cool and controlled, but there was a hint of surprise in his eyes. "I need to talk to you about something important." She said, her voice steady, but her hands were trembling at her sides. He raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest, clearly uninterested. But Sarah wasn't backing down, not this time. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let this moment slip through her fingers. "I've had a problem with a passenger," she said, her voice more firm now, "and with a manager who didn't back me up. The rules were clear, and I did everything by the book, but the system is broken, and I need to know why nothing is being done about it." The supervisor's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly as if he were weighing her words carefully. Sarah could feel the tension in the room, but she stood her ground. Her gaze never wavered. "I've been working this job for years. I've followed every rule and every protocol, and today I watched as that man walked right past me with nothing but a smile, because he has money and influence, because he thinks he's above the rules. I need to know why this is allowed to happen, why no one stood with me." The supervisor's fingers tapped against the edge of the desk, his eyes flicking to the side for just a second, but it was enough to make Sarah feel like he wasn't really listening, like he was waiting for her to finish so he could dismiss her. "You don't understand how things work here," he said finally, his voice slow and deliberate, and Sarah could hear the underlying tone of condescension in his words. "I understand perfectly," she shot back, her frustration spilling over. "This isn't about understanding. This is about doing what's right. This is about standing up for the rules and making sure that everyone is treated fairly, no matter who they are." He let out a soft laugh, like she was some kind of naive child who didn't get the way the world worked. He leaned forward in his chair and met her gaze with an almost pitying look. "You're wasting your time, Sarah," he said coldly. "This isn't about rules anymore. This is about power. People like him, they don't care about rules, they make the rules. And you're just one person, you can't change anything." "That's where you're wrong," she said, her voice rising with every word. "You think, because I'm just one person, I don't matter. But I do, I matter, and so does everyone else who gets overlooked. and walked all over just because they don't have the right connections or the right name. She took a step forward, the fire in her eyes undeniable. I won't just accept this. I won't sit quietly while everything I've worked for is trampled on. If you won't do something about it, then I will. The supervisor didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied her face, as if trying to gauge how serious she was. Sarah didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She knew what she was doing was risky. But it didn't matter. She had come too far to back down now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed and rubbed his temples, his eyes closing for a moment before he opened them again, and looked at her with a mixture of frustration and something else. "Fine," he said, his voice low and resigned. "You want to make a change, fine. But you'll have to do it without me. You'll have to do it on your own." Sarah's heart skipped a beat for a moment. She thought she had failed, but then she saw it in his eyes, a flicker of something like respect. Or maybe it was just acknowledgement, but it was enough. She turned and walked out of the office, her steps lighter than they had been in days. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time since this all started, she felt like she might actually have a chance.